Now, the Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Jenrick, says extremists are ruling the roost in UK prisons as outrage continues to grow following that gruesome attack from a Manchester Arena bomb plotter inside a high-security prison.
Yes, it was Hashim Abedi who attacked 3 prison officers, hot oil, makeshift weapons, and now questions are being asked as to how he had access to a self-cooked kitchen to begin with, and also access to these materials that he could use in this attack, seeing as he was known to be one of the most dangerous inmates in the United Kingdom with a history of attacking officers.
Well, delighted to be joined now by the Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Jenrick. Robert, this just seems like an extraordinary failure. This guy is supposed to be in one of the most high-security prisons, under constant watchful eye, and yet he was given cooking materials, metal, cooking oil. How could it be allowed to happen?
Look, I think it's a very, very concerning incident. As you say, this is one of the most dangerous men in the country. He was in prison. He was actually in a so-called separation unit, which is an area of the prison that is designed to stop extremists from causing difficulties. And yet he had access to materials that he used to create a makeshift weapon and stab prison officers, and to boiling oil that he ultimately used to pour on the officers. Obviously, my thoughts are with the officers and their families, but we've got to learn lessons from this. In fact, this has got to be a turning point. And there's a broader issue here, which is about Islamist extremism within our prisons. There is mounting evidence, and I and others have been warning about this for some time, that Islamic organisations, there's one called the Brotherhood, which forcibly converts people within our prisons, are ruling the roost in our jails, that they are dictating to governors how the jails operate. They're dictating things such as the diet of prisoners. They are operating quasi-Sharia courts within prisons, and they are controlling them with floggings and beatings. And this has got to end. Governors have got to assert themselves and take back control of these prison wards. There should not be individuals like this, these Islamist gangs, taking control of our prisons.
I mean, to undo everything that's happened in our prisons will be an extraordinarily difficult task. So does this fall on governors to sort out? Because we know that prison officers, they're not exactly paid a lot, are they, for what is an extremely difficult and unfortunately dangerous job? How can you unwind that culture in so many of our prisons?
Well, I think we should all have gratitude to prison officers. It's a tough job. As you say, it's not a well-paid job. What we've got to see here are prison governors stepping up and actively asserting themselves once again, not appeasing dangerous people and Islamist groups within our prisons. You should never be putting the welfare of criminals above the safety of prison officers. And that's what essentially has been happening. And I think as a result of some rulings that we've seen in the court, which have tied the hands of prison governors, and a general culture of political correctness, there has not been an effort to take on Islamism within our jails. I mean, your viewers, I think, would be shocked to learn, for example, in HMP Whitemoor, where there was a serious incident yesterday, a murder happened, 45% of the prisoners in that prison are now Muslim. Most were not born Muslim. Most are actually black British men who have converted to Islam whilst they've been in jail, many under the guise of this organisation called the Brotherhood. That is deeply concerning. Something is going on within these prisons. We've got to get a grip of this and ensure that people are not being forcibly converted, and you're not having these practices able to essentially rule the roost.
It's an extraordinary statistic. I do wonder the breakdown of that, of how many of that is conversion, and we'll have to look into that.
But it does speak to, we spoke to a former inmate a little bit earlier on this show who said people often convert for protection. People often convert because there's this sort of sub-justice organisation running through the prisons. And frankly, how much of this is a consequence of one of the topics we keep going back to over the course of the last 12 months, overcrowding in our prisons? I mean, the fact that we haven't built enough new prisons over the course of decades, that we should have more prisons, and if they were less overcrowded, perhaps they would be easier to govern, that you wouldn't have these gangs, religious or otherwise, operating within our prisons.
I think there's some truth in that. We obviously should be building more prison places.
Why did the Conservative government for 14 years fail to do that?
Well, it did build more prison places than many of its predecessors.
Not per person, because the population rose by millions.
It did build more than the last Labour government, but I think we need to build far more. It took too long to build them. The cost per prison cell is ridiculous today. It's something like £700,000 per prison cell. So we should be building more. But a lot of this is actually common sense. And if you look at the incident, the terrible incident that happened on Saturday, why was somebody who was one of the most dangerous men in Britain given access to a kitchen with all of the facilities that are available to that? This is common sense. That should not be happening. The incident that's happened yesterday at HMP Whitemoor, again, this was in their version of a separation unit, what's called a supervision centre, somewhere where the most dangerous individuals are held. How was somebody in that centre able to go on and kill another inmate? Something is going badly wrong in our prisons. The governors and the Ministry of Justice have got to get a grip on this situation.
Now, a lot of our viewers are concerned as to how this family were in the country to begin with. I understand that the father was a member of a group called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, who at the time were opposed to Gaddafi. And so the parents were granted asylum in this country back in 1993. Then clear evidence that they were travelling between Tripoli and Manchester throughout those years, and clearly radicalising or helping to radicalise their children. I believe one of the boys has escaped to another country, possibly to Libya as well in the meantime. But why were they granted asylum in the first place? Do we have any answers to that? Was it just our enemy's enemy is our friend?
Well, we don't know all the details because they've never been published. But I think, as you say, it's a parable of what's gone wrong in our asylum system over the last 20 or 30 years, that these individuals fled from the Gaddafi regime, were granted asylum here in the United Kingdom. But it seems to be gross naivety, because just because they were supposedly enemies of the Gaddafi regime does not mean that they are friends of the United Kingdom or people who are safe and suitable to be living amongst British citizens. Far from it. The evidence suggests they went on to radicalise their children, who went on to commit one of the most heinous terrorist attacks in our country in modern times. So, of course, there is a role in very limited circumstances for asylum, but we should be exercising with the greatest degree of care. And at the moment, because the numbers are so vast, they're coming into the system, no doubt decisions are being made which are careless and for which the consequences are going to be felt for decades to come.
Also, if the government find out that the family are happily travelling between the two countries, then presumably they can't be in need of asylum or in threat of their own lives in that country. And we see that so much with other cases, don't we? People actually travelling back to Iran or Iraq or wherever it is.
Well, we've seen it with asylum hotels, where when Home Office officials have gone in to audit who's there, many of the rooms are empty because the people who are supposedly claiming asylum here in the UK have gone back on holiday to Albania or to wherever they came from originally to go and meet their friends and their family. The whole system is fundamentally broken, but it comes back to the issue which I've said time and again. You cannot allow these people into the country in the first place. That's why you've got to have a proper deterrent. When you come here, for example, on a small boat, you should be being detained, you should be being removed. The only way to do that is to completely change our human rights laws, leave the European Convention on Human Rights, and have an altogether different asylum system.
Just finally, this is very interesting, because you've always been very clear on this point, that we have to leave the European Convention of Human Rights and the jurisdiction of the court in order to properly have the ability to deport these individuals. That's not the Conservative Party's position, though. There does seem to be some ambiguity between yourself and your party leader, who leaves that option open on the table, but says more needs to be done to work through how that would be achieved. Is there a difference there between you and Kemi Badenoch?
Well, my view is well known and long-standing. Kemi has said that she is prepared to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, and she's initiated a policy process now to analyse these issues and to come to a final position. And that will no doubt happen in the course of this year.
You're a shadow minister in her shadow ministry. I mean, how can you have a different position to your party leader?
Well, I don't think our positions are so distinct, actually. I've given this a great deal of thought, have come to my own view. She also believes that we should consider leaving, in fact, that she thinks it's the most likely outcome. But she wants to initiate a policy process whereby we field other people's views, we think through the issues, and then come to a settled view later in the year. And
you'll abide by that view if it's different from your current view?
Well, I hope I can persuade the party that this is the right way. And I think the argument is moving in this direction. I mean, you saw just a couple of weeks ago Jack Straw, a former Labour Justice Secretary, Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, come to the same view as well. David Blunkett the other day came close to making the same argument. So I think politics is converging on the view that our human rights laws are completely outdated and we need to change them.
Well, you've got a British law firm now trying to use the ECHR to represent Hamas in this country, try to de-prescribe them. So that's nice, isn't it? With more of these stories coming out, yes, I'm sure the mood is shifting. Robert Jenrick, thank you very much.
You.
Shadow Justice Secretary there. Let us know your thoughts at home.